Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD and The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess HD, and why I think these games will come as a collection. And so we're totally clear here, the point of this video isn't to talk about whether we will see these games come at some point for Nintendo Switch. We've discussed that a few times in the past already, they've been rumored for some years, we don't know if it will happen for sure, take it with a grain of salt. But operating under the assumption that in these waning years of Switch, Nintendo finally puts these games out, in what form will they come? Will these already remastered games be released as single individual releases? Will they be packaged together in a collection like I'm thinking? Or will they be doing something a bit different? That's what I would like to focus on today. But before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. So several times in the past, I've discussed how I think these games will come in the form of a collection if they do come to Switch. But many have disagreed. Many think that Nintendo would take the games, as is, and release them individually at different times for the full, typical $60 USD price tag. Which, with no changes, would likely leave many people kind of upset, it would stir some controversy and conversation. But like many Nintendo games that stir up some controversy and conversation, they will still sell well regardless, so Nintendo will likely still do it. That's what some people think. And I do agree there's something to that idea, in the sense that Nintendo does see value in their products, and oftentimes they're not going to underprice whatever they're selling. They're going to sell it at a premium from the perspectives of many, but they will still sell well regardless. And in the case of something like Zelda, which is one of Nintendo's bigger franchises, that has a fan base that's known to be very passionate and very willing to buy all sorts of things relating to Zelda, I definitely at least agree that Nintendo isn't going to give us a very cheap price for a product when it comes to Zelda. Take The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD, that was a full-priced $60 USD game. And it wasn't a full-on remake, it was a relatively simple HD remaster. The game was upscaled, it was cleaned up a little bit, they added some quality of life features, multiple control options, including Pro Controller support, and also the game ran at 60 frames per second as opposed to 30 originally. It was remastered, but it didn't have any sort of significant visual overhaul, it didn't have any sort of significant new content, and yet Nintendo still felt comfortable pricing it as is. So I'm very well aware that Nintendo will put out a single game with minimal enhancements at $60, depending on what it is, like Zelda, or in the case of Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, although I would argue that still has far more significant visual enhancements compared to Skyward Sword. But it's all on a spectrum. With this all in mind though, I still think Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD would come in a collection. So why is that exactly? Well, in a sense, I think it does relate to what I was just discussing about how Nintendo likes to ensure that their games are considered of high value. In other words, being priced highly and still expecting them to sell well, and oftentimes they do. The reason that happens is because of the brand, the power of the brand, and just how well people trust the quality of Nintendo games and how much people like certain Nintendo franchises. Nintendo protects that. They protect their brand image, this perception of high quality. It's one of the main reasons why Nintendo is so protective of their IP, debatably to a fault. This is why we don't see Samus in Fortnite. It's why we don't get that many Nintendo movies, or why they take down ROMs and fan games all the time. They are extremely protective of their IP, to a fault, many would argue. But it's all about the brand image is the main point here. And so, with that in mind, I don't think it would be a good look for the brand to take games that came out back in the very early 2000s on Nintendo GameCube, remaster them on Wii U, and then many years later, 8 to 11 assuming they come out this year, and depending on which game we're talking about, Twilight Princess or Wind Waker, put them out again exactly the same with no changes. I don't think that's good for the brand, I don't think that's a good look, I don't think that's something Nintendo would do. Some of you may disagree, but I will then challenge that by asking, can you think of a time Nintendo has remastered a game already, and then re-released that remaster with next to no changes again years later. I can't think of a single example. If you can, let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear it. But there is a little bit of a history of Nintendo releasing games more than once in various forms. Take, for example, Super Mario 64. Came out originally on the Nintendo 64, but then they released a newer version with new content and different visuals on the Nintendo DS, Super Mario 64 DS. And then years later for the Nintendo Switch, we got to see another new version for Mario 64. We're not talking about the Virtual Console or Nintendo Switch Online where they just port over the game. We're talking about another form of remaster remake. And that was the remastered version of Mario 64 that was a part of the Super Mario 3D All-Stars collection. And something else I find interesting about this particular example is that in the lead up to 3D All-Stars, it was rumored, there was a clamoring for it. It felt very much like the excitement for Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD. These are all fan favorite games that have been heralded over the years that people would like to play again. And so Nintendo released a collection of 3 big Mario games, and I think they will do something similar for Zelda. But 3D All-Stars isn't the only example on Switch where Nintendo had already remastered a particular game and then released it in a different way in the form of a collection. Here's another, Pikmin 1 and 2. So Pikmin 1 and 2 were also released on the Nintendo GameCube, but during the Wii era saw remastered versions in the New Play Control series. And last year, shortly before the release of Pikmin 4, what did Nintendo do? They released a bundle of Pikmin 1 and 2 remastered HD versions with updated controls. Now, something to note about this particular bundle, you could buy them together, or you could buy them separately. You save a little bit of money when you buy them together. But point is, they did come in as a bundle. And I also think this is an interesting example to bring up here, because I think it actually could be suggestive of the mold Nintendo might follow for this hypothetical collection of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess. Because I think if they were to do something like this, there would definitely be sort of an effort to celebrate the franchise, take advantage of that Zelda fan passion, and release a physical version that is kind of like a collector's item. Actually, this would also be similar to 3D All-Stars, where it was kind of like a collector's item where it was a limited release. I wouldn't be surprised if they do this in a very similar way. However, if you choose to buy the game digitally, you can buy as a bundle, perhaps save some money, but if you only want one of the games, you can still buy them separately on the eShop. And regardless if you buy the physical version on a cartridge or if you buy the bundle on the eShop, they will still represent as their own separate games on the Switch menu. Several games do this, where you buy a cartridge and it still ends up being more than one game on the system. But going back to how I think a collection makes the most sense, if Nintendo were to go back to these games that have already been remastered, I think their brand integrity would leave them to change it in some way. And maybe that doesn't end up as a collection like 3D All-Stars or Pikmin 1 and 2, but it would mean something has to be changed, significantly. Like, as opposed to them being remastered, I would think they would need to be remade instead. So we'd be talking about a far more ambitious effort here. And if that's to happen, then I'd only be expecting one of these games. But the rumor talks about both. And so I think the strong implication here is that since the games were already remastered on the Wii U, that essentially has the same graphics as the Switch. It's a little bit weaker, but overall it's about the same. There isn't really much reason to put in any sort of significant changes on Switch versions of these games. Maybe they could add 60 FPS support, but I don't really think that would be that much of a significant enhancement. It would be nice, sure, but if you've already played the game a few times, would you really feel like buying it again just in 60 FPS? It likely depends on the person. But also, I think if they were to do this, it would be in some way to counteract the fact that they likely would have to strip down features if these games would be brought over to Switch, because there's a lot of gamepad Wii U features that were integrated into both these games that you just wouldn't have on Switch. So then you would be raising another potential issue here. If you were to release these games individually at a full price, they would be less than the ones we saw on Wii U. There is no second screen gameplay. You cannot have a separate map screen while you're playing the game simultaneously. It's just not possible on Switch. And there won't be anything like Miiverse support. So if these games were to come out individually, they would be lesser. And if Nintendo were to price it the same, $60, but many years later, close to a decade if not more, depending on which game we're talking about and how much longer we have to wait, that ain't good for brand recognition. That ain't gonna go over well. This would be a worse situation than Skyward Sword HD by a significant margin, because at least that was a new remaster. These would be just rehashes with less of them. I think the only way you make it work is either A, you go back to the drawing board and remake one of these games, or you bring them in as a collection adapted for Switch. Maybe with 60 FPS to make up for the fact that you're stripping down some Wii U features, but to me, that seems to be the most reasonable. And just to name something else as another example of how Nintendo tends to treat their franchises when it comes to re-releases. We saw Metroid Prime, the original release back on GameCube, but then it was remastered in a collection for Metroid Prime Trilogy on Wii. And then on Switch, it wasn't a collection, but it was one single game that was greatly remastered in Metroid Prime Remastered. And so no, it wasn't a collection, but it was something different. It had a major overhaul, it showed value. It wasn't just a carbon copy of what they had done before, just released years later, full price. They would not do that. And so that's why I think most likely, what we're going to get, if this rumor proves to be true, is that they'll put them together as a collection. But you have the option to buy them separately through the eShop. That's what I think. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.